souls. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. My name is Carolyn. This channel is all about true crime, mystery, and anything abnormal. I highly recommend subscribing because this channel is definitely a vibe. I hope you're all doing amazing and welcome to spooky season. So to start off spooky season, let's talk about a cannibal. Sounds like a good idea, right? Peter Bryan was born in London, England on October 4th, 1969. He ended up dropping out of school at the age of 14 and he got a job working, and he actually ended up getting a job working at a homeless shelter teaching cooking lessons. And let me just say, this is not a man who should be teaching cooking lessons, but that's going to come later in the story. When he was 18 years old, he was living in an apartment and he got into an argument with one of his neighbors, and he ended up trying to throw the neighbor that he was in the argument with off of a balcony on the 6th floor. Now, he wasn't successful in actually throwing the guy over, thankfully. So obviously the police were called, and when they spoke to the man that Peter had tried to throw off the balcony, the man told the police that it was completely unprovoked and he really had never had any bad interactions with Peter before, and he really had no idea why Peter had unprovoked attacked him. There ended up being no charges filed. When Bryan was 23, he was working at a clothing store and he developed a crush on the owner's daughter. It was 20-year-old Nina Sheath. Peter would make passes at Nisha quite often, and she was very polite with him, and said, I'm not interested, there's no interest here. But he just would not stop. In early March that year, Peter was caught stealing clothing from the clothing store that he worked at. The store that he worked at had it was a very expensive kind of boutique, and it had a lot of designer clothings and bags and things like that. So he started stealing from the employer, and obviously once the owner finds out, he fires Peter. So at this point, Peter was so angry. He was so angry that obviously he'd lost his job, but he was also really, really angry at Nisha for turning down his advances. A week after he was fired, on March 18th, 1993, he decided he was going to go back to the store and he was going to get revenge. He ran into the store. He was screaming and yelling, and he had a claw hammer in his hand. Now, at the time, Nisha was in the store. She's 20 years old, but in the store also is her 12-year-old brother. Nisha did her best to try to get away, but she really didn't even have a chance. And he just took the claw hammer and just hit her over and over in the head until she had no chance of survival. He had crushed her skull. And her 12-year-old brother had been there and witnessed the entire thing. An ambulance was called. She was pronounced dead at the scene. There was zero chance that she could have survived his attack. So then Peter knows, obviously police are going to come looking for him. So he decides to go for a little run, and he runs across the River Thames. Now, I don't know, I've been to London. I've never been in the river. I'm curious, if you're from the UK and because every time I read about this case, they always say he ran across the river. Wouldn't he have had to swim across the river? Because I have seen the river, and to me, it seems deep. I don't know. But if you're from the UK or you know more, let me know. Can you run across the river, or do you gotta swim? Because I really feel like you need to swim. I don't feel like it's that shallow. Maybe he was at a point where it was really shallow. I don't know. But anyways, he runs to try to escape is the moral of this long-winded explanation by me. So once he runs across or swims across the Thames River. He goes into a building, just like a random building, and he jumps out the window, supposedly attempting to unalive himself, but it was the 3rd floor that he jumped off of. So, I mean, he survived and ended up obviously being taken to hospital. So he was completely fine. He wasn't injured really or anything. So he was arrested obviously for the murder of Nisha. He was found guilty based on diminished responsibility in 1994 for the murder of Nisha. And from my understanding, England, it seems to be very similar to Canada. If you don't know, I'm Canadian. Here, when someone gets found, in Canada it's called not criminally responsible for mental health or, you know, mental issues. You don't really get a sentence. You get sent to a hospital and then the doctors determine if you need to stay there the rest of your life, if you get well enough to be transferred to different places. Like, it's really the doctors who decide. So it's not exactly like a sentence as in prison where you're like, you have to serve this many years. He gets sent to this hospital and the doctors are going to decide where, you know, when he'll get out, when he'll get transferred. And this is where shit just goes crazy. I don't know how else to put it. This is absolutely ridiculous. So at first he was sentenced to Rampton Maximum Security Psychiatric Unit in Northern England. When he first arrived at the facility, he was considered very high risk, very dangerous, very unpredictable. Like, everything that the doctors were seeing, it was not good. Like, this was not, you know, this was a patient that needed a lot of care and to be kept separate from other people. He was very unpredictable. He could become violent very easily. He was triggered very easily. Like, he was very, very unstable. But over time, the doctors who saw him at this facility, their opinion of him changed a lot over the years. By February 2001, he had spent 8 years in a maximum security psychiatric unit, and the doctors felt at that time that he had made a lot of progress. So he was then transferred to Johnson Howard Centre in Hackney, East London. And normally when a patient would be transferred into this kind of, they consider it like a transitional period, usually the minimum stay for a transitional period is 2 years. For some reason, after 6 months, doctors there felt like he was not that much of a risk. So after the 6 month in this transitional place where he should have minimally spent 2 years. 2 years wasn't enough for this guy. He should have never been moved out of the first thing, but I'm also giving you this information in hindsight. So after this 6 month transitional period, he gets moved into a halfway house with little to almost no supervision. He has a key, he can come and go as he pleases, and he has a lot of freedom. While Peter was staying at this sort of halfway house, he was being inappropriate with teen girls. And there was one girl in particular that he was inappropriate with, and he used to like blow, I think it's called blowing raspberry. You know when you have a little kid and you like blow on their stomach and it makes them laugh? He was doing this to teen girls, and her parents had a big problem with it. They felt it was extremely inappropriate. Why this man is even allowed living in a situation where he's living with a teen girl, I don't know, but these are the decisions that were made, and this is what happened. So once the parents are complaining like this, he's being inappropriate with teen girls, he gets kicked out of there. So Peter somehow makes himself the victim in this situation and says that he feels very threatened, and so they decide to transfer him. In 2003, psychiatrists who were monitoring him or evaluating him decided that he was not a risk to the public. He is. So then the psychiatrists at that place decide that he's not a threat to anyone. So he gets transferred to Newham General Hospital under the supervision of a psychiatrist who had never worked with anyone who had ever committed murder. So you have a psychiatrist evaluating a murderer with zero experience working with anyone who has ever killed anyone. He was also assigned a social worker who had only been a social worker for 5 months and had never worked or had any experience working with, she really had no experience at all. This is a man who has committed an absolutely horrific murder, and you give him a doctor with no experience and a social worker with no experience. What do you think's going to happen? Because guess what? It's not going to go well. In January 2004, this social worker, she wrote a letter stating that she had no further concerns about Peter Bryan and suggested that he be moved to low support accommodations. On February 17th, 2014, Peter, he was moved to the Topaz ward of Newham General Hospital. And at this point, he was considered a voluntary patient. Within 3 hours of this transfer, Peter left the hospital, which he's fully allowed to do, and headed straight to a hardware store to buy a claw hammer. Sound familiar? He then broke into the flat of a friend of his by the name of Bryan Cherry. And not long after he entered, neighbors started hearing horrific screams coming from Bryan Cherry's apartment. One of Bryan Cherry's neighbors hears this screaming, and she decides she's going to go to his apartment to see what's going on. So she goes to the door, and Peter opens the door. She gets the really strong smell of disinfectants, and Peter says to her right away, "Bryan's dead." And she doesn't believe him when he tells her this. So this woman, she doesn't know Peter. She does know her neighbor, Bryan. So she just walks right past him into his apartment. She wants to know what's going on and if this guy's okay. And she sees his body on the living room floor. And he's clearly deceased and missing limbs. Yeah, he's missing limbs. He had an arm missing and an attempt to take a leg. So obviously, luckily, she was able to escape. She just runs out of the apartment, obviously going to call the police. The police arrived, and it's a horrific scene. By the time the police arrive, Bryan's body, both of his arms were now removed. One of his legs was removed. And when the police went in, Peter said to them, "Bryan's dead." And then he said something so disgusting. He said, I gotta get the quote for this. I gotta quote this one right because it's crazy. What's the exact quote? The exact quote is, "I ate his brain with butter. It was really nice." Okay. So police obviously arrest him and take him into custody. And Bryan Cherry, when they did his autopsy, he had suffered 24 blows to the head with the claw hammer, as well as both of his arms, as I had mentioned, being amputated, one of his legs. And Peter claims that the only reason that he hadn't taken the other leg or the head yet, he'd been in the head to get the brain, but the reason it wasn't taken off and the other leg wasn't taken off because he didn't have enough time. 2 months later, on April 15th, 2004, Bryan was admitted to Broadmoor. And if you're into true crime, you know all about Broadmoor. So you think, okay, he's in Broadmoor. Broadmoor, they seem to handle pretty violent people pretty well. Is Broadmoor going to be the one that gets this right? Not the first time. Not the first time. Not the first time. Within days of him arriving at Broadmoor, which is just days after he took a claw hammer to someone's head and cooked and ate their brain, after less than a week, within a couple days, they decide, you know, he's kind of a low risk person. You know, let's put him into the medium security. He's not a high risk, definitely not a high risk. This man has killed 2 people with claw hammers. Definitely not a risk. So they decide to put him in a medium risk. Obviously this is going to be a mistake. Richard Loudwell, he was a 60-year-old man who was in the same medium risk ward that Peter was in at Broadmoor. He was awaiting trial for murder, and this is where the 2 of them interact. So just 10 days after being admitted to Broadmoor, Peter was in the dining hall or dining room, whatever it's called at the hospital, where he comes across Richard Ludwell. So not only does he take this cord, I think it's like pajamas almost. You know how if you get pajamas, they sometimes have that string that you tie around the waist? He had some kind of string or something around his waist that he used to wrap around Richard's head. And then he got him on the ground and just was like beating his head against the floor. Richard's obviously rushed to the hospital, but he didn't survive his injuries. He ended up dying less than a month later. So on March 15th, 2005, Peter Bryan pled guilty to 2 additional charges of manslaughter, and he is sentenced to Broadmoor for the rest of his life. Hopefully, they will keep him locked high security. And there was investigations done into all of these decisions that were made at all of these different hospitals and facilities, but no charges were ever nobody got in trouble for anything like that. So yeah, that's eating brains. I don't know. So I thought starting spooky season off with a cannibal was a good way to go. So I brought you a story where a man ate someone's brain. Do you think when they eat brains, do you think they think that makes them smarter? Because brain seems to be, when you think about cannibals, okay, I feel like brains are quite, I have a question for you. Do you think they eat brains because they think it'll make them smarter? Why do they always eat the brain? I see that so often. Because it's hard to get to. Anyways, I'm trying to apply logic to a cannibal. I don't think that's going to happen, Carolyn. Maybe you should just give it up. So anyways, I know my uploads have been so inconsistent and I'm all over the place and blah, 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 blah. And I'm sick of my own damn self, to be honest with you. But I hope you enjoyed the video. There will be another one very shortly. I just want to tell you that I really, really appreciate each and every one of you for tuning in, watching the videos. And if you'd like to support the channel, please stick around and watch another video. Give me a thumbs up if you liked it. It really helps out the channel. And I will see you in the next one.